Well, admittedly, the fog is pretty thick, so we can all be forgiven for being a little confused from time to time as to what is true and what isn't. We know, for instance, that last night, perhaps as many as 100 missiles were fired by the Russian forces. At least 50 to 60 of them penetrated Ukrainian air defenses and wiped out another substantial portion of the Ukrainian power grid. In fact, today, a spokesman for Zelensky pointed out that unless there are serious attempts made to prepare for the winter and improve the situation in Western Ukraine, they may have to evacuate whole cities where there is no power. The country is literally operating in the dark. So this doesn't bode well for Ukraine. At the same time, almost completely unrelated to this reality of Ukraine's descent into chaos because there is no energy, you have this strange announcement that we are suddenly sending, after 8 months of no accountability, a few hundred soldiers under a brigadier general into Ukraine with the mission of somehow or another tracking all of the equipment that's being sent. Well, we already know that large quantities of the equipment are being sold off to others around the world, including ISIS. What is this really all about? I mean, we've been at this for 8 months. We've spent $65 billion, and now suddenly we're worried about accountability. This is beginning to look a little like an advance party for this very dangerous proposition that a multinational coalition of the willing, a force of perhaps 50, 60, 70, 80,000 Western troops, will eventually go into Western Ukraine. This was floated, as you know, a couple of weeks ago by General Retired Petraeus.
Right.
And people at the time tended to dismiss it. I said, no, you've got to take this very seriously. He wouldn't say it unless others had urged him to do so. So I think this may have something to do with it. We don't know how many Americans, contractors in uniform and so forth, are already in the country anyway. But if this is what I think it is, there's also another rumor floating around inside the Beltway. It hasn't been officially announced, but I think it may be, that we're actually talking about standing up a Russian government in exile. Now, if you're interested in coming to some sort of arrangements with Moscow,
wow.
First of all, don't put together a multinational force to intervene, because the Russians have already said, if you do this, we'll destroy it effectively. So if we go in there, we're going to be at war with Russia. Perhaps the multinational force is designed to try and drag NATO as an alliance into this war that the Europeans, frankly, would otherwise not want to fight. And the second thing is, if your purpose is not regime change, as stated by President Biden, why would anyone even consider the idea of setting up a Russian government in exile? If any of this is supposed to promote peace, understanding, whatever you want to call it, let alone an agreement with Russia, I'd say none of it works. I'd say none of it works. You talk about an advanced party in the military, any unit, before it moves into a quote-unquote assembly area, before it goes to an area where it might fight, it sends a small number of officers and soldiers and non-commissioned officers to examine the area and look for good places to establish positions, good places to set up assembly areas. For instance, I was part of the advance party for the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment back in 1990 before we deployed to Saudi Arabia. I went down 2 weeks early with others, and we went into the desert and scouted the area and looked for places where we could set up. Ultimately, we used them. It doesn't take very many people to do that. The other problem with this 200 or 300 man contingent under the 1-star is, why would they need a 1-star? In fact, why would they need anybody in uniform at all? Most of the time, inspectors are in civilian clothes because they're designed not to alarm and provoke either the host country or potential opponents. So it's perfectly logical to say that these people are looking for areas where they could set up, where they can establish power, where they can fuel themselves, where they can sustain themselves, live. And I don't know what else you could point to, because the notion that they are going to track in an area the size of Texas all of the equipment, at least 40% of which is being sold off and sent to other countries, you don't see it happening. So I think it's more likely that they'll stay west of the Dnieper River. And one of the points that's being made is that these forces, if they go in, will stay out of artillery range. The same thing is true for these inspectors, that they will not go forward where they might come under fire by Russian forces that is within artillery range. The problem with the notion of outside of artillery range is it excludes the tactical and theater ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, which the Russians have thousands of, carrying up to 1,000-pound conventional warheads, conventional explosives. These are pinpoint accurate in their destinations. So frankly, from the moment you step over the border from Poland into Ukraine, or over the border from Romania into Ukraine, you could be targeted. And we tend to forget that just as we have space-based and terrestrial intelligence gathering assets, in other words, satellites and unmanned systems, so do the Russians. The notion that you're going to fool anybody, sneak in over the night and set up somewhere in Western Ukraine with impunity is crazy. If we go into that country, we will come under fire. And frankly, if you're a Russian, you know this is quote unquote multinational. Your first instinct is to destroy the U.S. forces, who are ultimately leading it, who are the core element of the force, as well as U.S. command and control, which is effectively NATO command and control. NATO has no independent command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, none of it. It's all dependent upon us. So this is an invitation to direct war with Russia. Well, it depends on your perspective. I think the assumption is potentially inside this administration that if they go into Western Ukraine and our forces do come under fire and American lives are lost, that there will be, quote unquote, a rally round the flag effect inside the United States, and everyone will clamor for war with Russia. You know, it's happened before. I mean, if we go back to Pearl Harbor, I mean, quite frankly, Pearl Harbor was something that everyone knew was inevitable as soon as the oil embargo was imposed on Japan. And the Japanese submitted 3 peace proposals, the last one in October of 1941 that met all of our demands, and we rejected all of it. So the Navy wanted to move the fleet out of Pearl Harbor, and FDR insisted that it stay there. Now, as a result, the United States, if you look at the polling data, which was overwhelmingly opposed to entrance into war in Europe, was then left with no choice, a fait accompli. But this is not Pearl Harbor. Western Ukraine is not Pearl Harbor. It is not part of the United States. It's not territory that we protect. It is not an extension of NATO. And so if we do this, I think they're making a mistake. I think a lot of people are going to be suspicious and say, well, wait a minute. What are we doing in Western Ukraine anyway? But I suspect they're betting that they might be able to get what they want, which is a direct military confrontation with Russia. We haven't even talked